Hello everyone. Today is my second video on the EU's electricity grid. We're going to be talking about why Europe still relies on natural gas. So I've put up a graph here of the EU's natural gas. We see from recent events in Iran, the price almost doubled from 30, it's almost reached 60 now. Today I'm going to be talking about how that's going to affect some countries in the EU and the EU in general. But before I do that, first I have to talk about natural gas itself. So natural gas is not one market. So here's the EU natural gas, the US, and Asian natural gas. And we see all three of them are actually quite different. We only see the Europe and the Asian one a spike in the recent. The US one, almost no effect. So why is that the case? So I've put up here all the regions and their share of how much gas is transferred via pipeline and how much via LNG. So starting off with America, 80 to 85% is through local pipelines, or local as in the continent, and only 15 to 20% is exported out as LNG. Asia is somewhere around 50-50. Japan and Korea are actually 100% LNG, and then China is around 60-40, with 60% coming from Russia through pipeline. Finally, Europe, we see pre-2022, the war with Russia, LNG share of only about 25 to 30%, and after the war that switched to around 40 to 45% as they became more reliant on LNG. So with that in mind, we see the gas prices in 2022 in Europe, as it was the main culprit, around 10x, as they had to switch from natural gas coming in from pipeline to LNG. Asian, which is mostly LNG, also 7x, as Europe was basically bidding for that same price, for the same gas. And the US, it almost 3x. So there wasn't really an issue in the US, but due to competition from EU basically bidding LNG, that also increased the price, but not as dramatically as the other prices. So to give a bit more detail about how gas works in the EU, basically every country has storage of gas, and they fill it up during summer and then they use it over winter, as you'd expect. And then looking at 2022, essentially during filling it up, that's when Russia started cutting most of the supply. And they were only able to fill up to around 75%. And then knowing that is going to be a problem, especially after the pipeline was blown up and the new supply was never coming back, that's when they started aggressively bidding up the LNG, basically getting LNG at any cost, which is what caused the spike both in EU and Asia and America. So now coming back into today again, so we see that injections into the storage start somewhere around the 1st of April. So today that I'm filming this video, it's the 21st of March. And here we see a week before the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, they kind of expected that it was going to happen, so they started injecting already into some of their storage, maybe a bit earlier than they usually would. But still, we're going to have to see how it's going to follow on to see whether they're going to keep injecting or stop. Remember, 20% of LNG comes from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz. So the current gas level is quite low, around 25%, actually lower than in 2022. So it's going to be quite critical to see what they're going to do with that. Anyway, so now I'm going to look at some cases of some countries and how gas actually reflects onto the electricity grid. So starting off with Greece, public power corporations, essentially the one big power corporation that Greece has. And we see in 2022, revenues basically 2x'd. So another 5.7 billion revenue was added, but only at a cost of around 1 billion of natural gas. So how is this possible? So those of you who saw my first video in the series know about the cost curve, and essentially that the marginal price setter, which is the most expensive one to produce, actually sets the price of. So they actually profit much more from all their other sources if gas is the most expensive source and if gas gets more expensive. So if they were to get gas out, this is what the cost curves would look. And suddenly their coal isn't making any money, and solar and wind and hydro are making decent profits, but not as much as in this case. And we can definitely see that in the financial reports of the company. So they're trying desperately to become lignite free, so coal free. And looks like they're about to pretty much manage that goal. However, they always plan to keep a small amount of oil and gas to produce electricity. And then the whole entire rest of the electricity they'd want to come from really cheap renewables. So their goal is to essentially have this cost curve as much as possible. Right, so even if this was the case, their profits were still eroded due to price instability. The prices that year were so unstable, and they still have a duty to keep essentially the electricity grid running. So they actually had to purchase a lot of energy at really, really high prices. And that actually also destroyed their profit margins, despite the consumer essentially paying almost double the cost. So up next, I'm going to look at France. And as most people know, France, very high nuclear, around 70 to 75%. And the rest of the sources, mostly renewables, and then we have natural gas here around 3 to 5%. So over here I've put it's an AI generated graph, so don't pay attention to the detail, but essentially gas only needs to be used and is only the marginal price setter in a small period of the day, usually right after the sun sets and most people go home. That's where there's a really high demand spike. But it only sets the price for a couple hours within that time, and the rest of the day is pretty much set either by nuclear or hydro. So what this ends up having is a way more stable and lower wholesale price, both compared to Germany and Greece. We see both lower variance and lower price. If we want to compare France and Germany in terms of gas, you don't have to see much to see which one's more stable, both from a geopolitical point of view and from a grid point of view. Germany has consistently had problems during COVID with Russia, and most likely is going to be having problems this coming years, depending on how the situation develops. Looking at the prices themselves, we also see that reflected in it, with much more spiky behavior in Germany. Let's keep in mind that France and Germany are both linked. Their grids are very interlocked with each other. So usually price in one is going to follow the price in the other, which is also why France saw this big spike in prices. However, energy stability is generally always going to yield both higher profits for corporations and lower prices for consumers. Plus, we can see that the price of French energy is much lower than German one. So overall, a much better grid from France than Germany. So concluding today's video, gas is a local market, whereas LNG is global. An energy monopoly or cartel will always prefer to keep the gas as the marginal price setter for maximum profit. And finally, a stable grid benefits both consumers and corporations.